Imagine a holy man living deep in the forest, respected, feared, and worshipped. But what if I told you he was hiding a dark, terrible secret? This is the story of the Bloodthirsty Hermit, an old folk tale from India that was banned in some places for being too disturbing. A fake sage, a lion's blood, and a secret so shocking that it shook an entire kingdom. What was this secret, and how did the king uncover the truth? Stick with me as we dive into this chilling tale. Let's begin. The story takes us to an ancient kingdom ruled by a wise and powerful king. In the deep forests outside the kingdom, there lived a hermit, a man who claimed to have great spiritual powers. He was covered in strange markings, his robes stained red, and his eyes burned with wisdom, or so people believed. The villagers called him a sage, a holy man. They traveled from far and wide to seek his blessings. But what they did not know was that his wisdom came from a dark and terrible secret. Every full moon, this sage would go into the jungle. He would return the next day, his body smeared in red, his voice deeper, his presence more powerful. The people believed he had been blessed by the gods. They never questioned the blood on his hands. But one day, the king grew suspicious. He wanted to know more about this mysterious sage. And so, he sent his men to watch him closely. What they found was only the beginning of a horrifying truth. The story takes place in a kingdom surrounded by thick forests. In these forests, there lived a man who called himself a sage. People believed he was holy. He spoke in a deep voice and always covered his body with strange red markings. His hair was long and wild, and his eyes looked powerful. Villagers from nearby areas came to him for blessings. They thought he had great knowledge and could talk to the gods. They gave him food, gold, and gifts, hoping for his help. But there was something strange about this sage. Every full moon, he would disappear into the jungle. The next morning, he would return, covered in fresh red stains. He told the villagers that he had been meditating deep in the forest, that the gods had blessed him, and that his red markings were proof of his enlightenment. People believed him without question. Over time, the sage became famous. More and more people traveled to see him. Even noblemen and ministers from the king's court started visiting him. His words were mysterious, and his presence was strong. Many thought he could see the future and solve any problem. They trusted him completely. One day, news of this powerful sage reached the king. The king was a wise man. He did not believe in magic easily. But he also did not ignore the beliefs of his people. He wanted to know more. He sent his most trusted minister to visit the sage and report back. The minister traveled to the forest with a group of guards. They brought expensive gifts, hoping to impress the holy man. When they arrived, the sage welcomed them with a smile. He spoke calmly and wisely. The minister watched him carefully, but he saw nothing suspicious. The sage acted just as the people had described. Powerful, mysterious, and full of wisdom. But one thing caught the minister's attention. He noticed that the sage's robes were not just red from markings. There were stains that looked fresh, as if the red color had been added recently. The minister thought it was unusual. He decided to stay for the night and watch the sage more closely. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, the minister quietly followed the sage. He saw him walk deep into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. The minister wanted to know where he was going, but he knew it was too dangerous to follow him alone. Instead, he returned to the palace and told the king everything he had seen. The king listened carefully. He knew that something was not right. A true sage should not have fresh bloodstains on his clothes. A real holy man would not need to disappear every full moon. The king decided that he must uncover the truth himself. The king could not ignore the minister's report. He had always ruled with wisdom and fairness, and he knew that blind faith could sometimes hide dangerous secrets. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Instead of sending more messengers, he chose to visit the sage himself. But he would not go as a king. He would go in disguise as an ordinary man to see the truth with his own eyes. The next evening, the king dressed as a simple traveler. He wore plain clothes and left behind his royal guards. Only one of his most trusted soldiers followed him, hidden at a distance. Together, they made their way into the forest where the sage lived. When they arrived, they saw many people sitting before the sage, listening to his words. The air was filled with the smell of burning incense. The king quietly sat among the crowd, observing everything. The sage spoke in a slow and powerful voice. He talked about the power of the gods, the secrets of the universe, and the meaning of life. His words were smooth and well-practiced, as if he had repeated them many times before. The king noticed how people looked at the sage with complete devotion. They believed every word he said. They bowed before him, offering food, coins, and gifts. The sage accepted everything with a calm smile, blessing them in return. But the king also saw something else: fear. Some people looked nervous, as if they were afraid to displease the sage. Then, as the night grew darker, the sage stood up and raised his hands. He told the people that the gods had called him for a sacred ritual, one that could not be disturbed. He warned them not to follow him. With that, he turned and walked deep into the forest, disappearing into the trees. The king knew this was his chance. He quickly stood up and followed the sage, staying far enough behind to remain unseen. The trusted soldier followed as well, keeping watch from a distance. The forest was thick, and the path was rough, but the sage moved through it as if he knew every tree and stone. After some time, he arrived at a hidden cave. The king and his soldier hid behind the bushes, watching carefully. Inside the cave, there was a terrible sight. Bones were scattered on the ground, human bones. The remains of people who had come to the sage, never to return. The king felt his heart grow heavy. He realized the truth. This was no holy man. This was a murderer. But that was not the worst part. In the middle of the cave, lying on a bed of dried leaves, was a massive lion. Its golden mane was covered in dried blood. The sage walked up to the lion and bowed before it. He whispered strange words and placed his hands on the lion's face. The great beast let out a deep growl but did not attack. Instead, it seemed to recognize him. Then, the sage did something shocking. He took out a small bowl filled with dark red liquid fresh blood. Carefully, he dipped his fingers in it and smeared it all over his own body. The king suddenly understood everything. The sage had been using lion's blood to fool the people. He had been feeding the lion with the bodies of his own devotees. The king stepped back, his mind racing. He had seen enough. The truth was far worse than he had imagined. Now he had to escape and bring justice before it was too late. The king felt his heartbeat quicken as he watched the horrifying scene before him. The truth was now clear. This so-called sage was nothing more than a dangerous fraud. He had tricked the people into believing he had divine powers, when in reality, he was using the blood of a lion to create an illusion of enlightenment. Even worse, he had been secretly sacrificing his followers to the beast that lay in the cave. The lion stretched its massive paws and let out a deep, rumbling growl. It was a terrifying creature, larger than any lion the king had ever seen. Its golden fur was matted with old blood, and its sharp teeth gleamed in the dim torchlight. The sage whispered to the lion, stroking its mane, and then turned to a dark corner of the cave. The king and his soldier crouched lower, trying to remain unseen. From the shadows, a second man stepped forward. He was thin and dressed in rags, his face covered in dirt. He carried a small wooden tray, and on it lay a freshly cut piece of raw meat. The king's stomach turned as he realized what it was. Human flesh. The sage took the tray, lifted it toward the lion, and spoke in a low voice. "My brother, accept this offering. It is through your power that I rule, and it is through my wisdom that you remain strong." The lion sniffed the meat and then tore into it with its powerful jaws. The sound of bones cracking filled the air. The king felt his fists clench. This was no holy man. This was a monster. Then, the sage stepped toward a large stone slab in the cave. It was covered in symbols drawn with what looked like blood. He dipped his fingers into a small clay pot and began marking his own body, whispering words that sounded like an ancient prayer. The thin man in rags bowed deeply before him, never daring to meet his eyes. The king now understood everything. The sage had made a pact with the lion. In exchange for human sacrifices, the lion allowed him to rule over the forest, keeping the people in fear and devotion. The sage's power was not from the gods. It was from blood and deception. The king turned to his soldier and signaled that it was time to leave. But just as they began moving away, a dry branch snapped under the soldier's foot. The sharp sound echoed through the cave. The sage froze. The lion stopped eating. The thin man's eyes widened with fear. The king and his soldier held their breath. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, The sage turned his head sharply toward the entrance of the cave. His eyes narrowed. "Who is there?" he called out, his voice no longer calm and wise but cold and suspicious. The lion lifted its head, its ears twitching, sensing danger. The king knew they had only moments before they were discovered. He grabbed his soldier's arm, and they quickly stepped back into the cover of the trees. The sage walked toward the entrance, holding a burning torch, its light flickering against the rough stone walls of the cave. The king and his soldier moved as silently as they could, but the sage was no fool. He turned to the thin man and ordered, "Go outside and check. If anyone is spying on us, bring them to me. Alive." The thin man hesitated for a moment, fear written all over his face, but he obeyed and stepped out into the darkness. The king and his soldier ducked behind a thick tree, their hearts pounding. They could hear the man's footsteps crunching on dry leaves as he searched the area. If he found them, there was no doubt he would call for the sage and the lion. The king knew that they could not allow themselves to be caught. The thin man moved closer, his eyes darting around the forest. The king could see him clearly now. His face was gaunt, his ribs showing beneath his torn clothes. He was not a willing servant of the sage. He was a prisoner, forced to do terrible things under threat of death. The king realized that this man might not be an enemy, but a victim. The man stepped closer to where the king and his soldier were hiding. The king had only seconds to make a decision. Would he attack and silence him, or take a risk and try to turn him into an ally? The king knew he had to act fast. If the thin man alerted the sage, they would have no chance of escaping. But the king also saw the fear in the man's eyes, the hesitation in his steps. This was not someone who served the sage willingly. He was a prisoner, forced into this terrible life. Instead of attacking, the king made a bold choice. He stepped forward, revealing himself. The soldier tensed, ready to fight, but the king raised a hand, signaling him to stay calm. The thin man's eyes widened in shock. His mouth opened, about to scream, but the king spoke first. "Do not be afraid," the king said in a firm but quiet voice. "We are not your enemies. We have seen the truth. We know what the sage is doing." The thin man hesitated, glancing back toward the cave. His hands trembled. He looked like a man caught between two forces, fear of the sage and a desperate hope for freedom. The king took another step closer. "You do not want to serve him," he continued. "I can see it in your eyes. You have been trapped in this place for too long. But you can help us. Help us stop him." The man's lips quivered, and for a moment, it seemed like he would run. But then he looked at the king closely. There was something different about this stranger. He did not speak like the others who came to worship the sage. His words carried strength, authority, and something the thin man had not felt in a long time: trust. You don't know what he will do if he finds you," the thin man whispered. "He is not just a fraud. He is something worse. He is dangerous. If he knows you are here, he will not let you leave alive." The king nodded. "That is why we need to stop him before he can harm anyone else." The thin man swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the cave. Inside, the sage was still standing near the lion, unaware of what was happening outside. The man's breath came in short gasps as he struggled with the decision. But then, he lowered his head and whispered, "I will help you, but you must promise to take me away from this place." The king placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder. "I give you my word." The thin man took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, he spoke in a hurried voice. "The sage is not just pretending to have power. He believes he is something greater than a man. He calls the lion his brother, but I have heard his true secret." The king listened carefully. He was not always a sage. He came from a village far away. He had a family, a home. But one day, he went into the jungle and never returned. When he came back, he was different. He spoke of visions, of hearing the voice of the lion god. He claimed the lion spoke to him, told him that they were connected by blood. At first, people laughed at him. But then, strange things began to happen. People who doubted him disappeared. Those who followed him were rewarded. Over time, he gained power, and the people feared him too much to question him. The king's brows furrowed. "And the lion?" The thin man's face grew pale. "The lion came later. No one knows how he tamed it, but he did. He calls it his brother because he says they share the same soul. He feeds it human flesh, telling his followers it is a divine ritual. But it is only hunger. The lion does not care for his words. It only cares for blood." The king's soldier, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. "We must return to the palace at once. The king must hear of this." The thin man shook his head. "No. If you leave now, he will know someone was watching. He will move his camp. He will change his rituals. You may never find him again." The king understood. This was their only chance. They had to act now while the sage still believed he was in control. But how could they stop a man who had spent years building his power? How could they defeat a beast that had tasted human flesh for so long? The thin man took a shaky breath. "There is a way, but it is dangerous." The king met his gaze. "Tell me." The thin man hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "The sage's power is tied to the lion. Without the lion, he is nothing. If you want to defeat him, you must separate them. The lion must die first." The soldier's eyes widened. "Kill the lion? That beast is massive. It will not fall easily." The thin man nodded. "That is why we need a plan. Listen carefully, because we do not have much time." And with that, the thin man began to reveal the only way to bring down the false sage and his bloodthirsty beast. The plan was set. The king, his soldier, and the thin man knew they had only one chance. If they failed, the sage would disappear into the jungle, and his terrible rituals would continue. They had to act fast, but they had to be careful. The sage was not just a fraud. He had convinced his followers that he held divine power, and they would fight to protect him. The thin man led them to the edge of the clearing where the lion rested. It was a massive creature, its golden fur stained with dark patches of dried blood. Its muscles twitched even as it lay still, its ears flicking at the smallest sounds. The beast was always alert, always hungry. Near the lion, the sage sat cross-legged on a stone, his body smeared with the lion's blood, his long hair wild and tangled. He looked like a man who had lost all sense of the world, his eyes staring into the distance as if he was speaking to some unseen force. The thin man whispered, "The lion never leaves his side. He believes they are one. If the lion dies, his power will break. But we must act fast. If he calls his followers, we will not escape." The king nodded. He turned to his soldier. "We will need to be swift. We attack the lion first. If the sage realizes what is happening, he will try to use his tricks to escape." The thin man hesitated before adding, "There is another thing. The sage is not as human as he appears. I have seen him do things that no man should be able to do. He speaks to the lion without words. He moves like a shadow in the night. If he has truly given part of himself to the beast, then he will not die easily." The soldier clenched his jaw. "Then we will make sure he does not get the chance to fight back." The three of them moved quickly. The king and his soldier took their positions on either side of the lion, while the thin man stayed behind, watching nervously. The moment was tense. The lion's tail flicked, and it lifted its head slightly, sensing something. And then the attack began. The king moved first, raising his weapon and striking at the lion's side. The beast roared in pain, leaping to its feet, its massive claws swiping at the air. The soldier struck next, aiming for the lion's throat, but the beast was fast. It dodged, snapping its jaws, nearly catching the soldier's arm. The ground shook beneath them as the lion lunged. The sage's eyes flew open. His mouth twisted into a snarl, not of fear, but of rage. He did not scream or call for help. Instead, he moved with an unnatural speed, leaping toward the lion, his hands reaching out as if he could stop the attack by sheer will alone. "You fools!" the sage roared. "You dare harm my brother? Do you not know what you have done?" But the king did not stop. He knew this was their only chance. The lion was powerful, but it bled like any other creature. Blow after blow, they struck, dodging the beast's deadly claws. The lion fought, its roars echoing through the jungle. But the king had fought many battles before. He knew how to weaken a stronger enemy. He aimed for the lion's legs, forcing it to slow down. The soldier delivered the final strike, a deep wound to the lion's throat. The beast let out one last terrible roar, its body shuddering before it collapsed. The earth beneath them seemed to tremble as the great lion, the so-called brother of the sage, took its last breath. And then, something strange happened. The sage let out a cry, but not of sorrow. It was a sound of agony, as if he himself had been wounded. His body convulsed, his hands clawing at his own chest. His wild eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the ground, writhing. The thin man gasped. "I told you, they were connected." His skin grew pale, his veins darkened, and a terrible, choking sound came from his throat. He looked like a man who had been drained of life. Without the lion, his power, his false divinity was gone. He was nothing but a broken man, exposed for what he truly was. The king stepped forward, standing over the fallen sage. "Your lies end here." The sage opened his mouth, as if to speak, but no words came. His breath was shallow, his strength fading fast. Without his beast, he was powerless. The king turned to the thin man. "You are free now. No one will fear him again." The thin man let out a breath he had been holding for years. His face, once twisted with fear, slowly relaxed. "It is over," he whispered. "He can hurt no one anymore." And with that, the false sage, the bloodthirsty hermit, breathed his last. The jungle was silent. The nightmare had ended. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.